Good evening, everyone. Today we start studying a new chapter, and that is Rebecca West's Return of a Soldier. The book was written in 1918. Let's get right to it. This is Rebecca West, as you can see. So, Rebecca West's novel is narrated by Jenny, Chris Baldry's cousin, whose limited jealous perspective colors the story. Now, let us find out something else that's interesting of this novel. Now, this novel surrounds the character called Chris Baldry, right? Who is a World War I officer home with shell shock and amnesia. Shell shock now is called PTSD, which is the post traumatic disorder. So, now that time, as you know, there was not a lot of psychological advancement, so we knew it as shell shock. He suffered shell shock after the aftermath of the war and he had amnesia. Amnesia is a mental disease, you could say, where there is a character or a person forgets, alright, for a period of time. There are two kinds of amnesia, retrograde and also in short time amnesia. Usually, patients with amnesia suffer it, and what they suffer is they forget a chunk of portion of their memory. It could be the present memory that they have, and they go back to memory of an earlier time slot. Here, Chris, already married after the war, forgets that he had married this woman called Kitty. She forgets his beautiful wife Kitty, but he remembers his time with his Monkey Island working class former fiancée Margaret. Now, its narrative technique is very important to note because it's based on Jenny, right? It's based, written first person narration by Jenny. It also creates dramatic irony. Jenny's biases, social snobbery, repressed love for Chris mean the reader receives a skewed account. As one critic notes, Jenny is not judgmental, but nastily so. Yet the reader also senses Margaret's dignity beneath Jenny's contempt. This unreliable perspective underscores themes of perception versus reality. Jenny must reconcile what she feels, jealousy and pity, with what she sees, Margaret's decency. Also, a very important fact that you must note here is the fact that this novel, written during the times where war happened, the World War I. So, women were treated as an undermined character, but we must not forget women did play a very important part as well. Right. So now I will tell you about a bit background before we get into the novel, right? So let's go and cut it very short, right? So now this novel is West's first novel, and it's also written and republished, first published in 1918, and also has been republished for the Virago 40 series. At the beginning of the novel, the soldier of the title, our Chris Baldry, he's injured and he's sent back from the France. But Chris Baldry, though an important character in this novel, is secondary to the woman who must care for him. The novel itself is primarily about the role and labor of women in wartime, not the nurses, ambulance drivers, or munitions workers, but all the nurturing, disciplining, and symbolic work done by sisters, wives, mothers, and soldiers. Lovers, who try to maintain the home fire and the soldiers who defend it. West's first novel is a variation on a story familiar from romance and melodrama. Two women who have claims on one man. What does each woman promise? What values does each represent? And whose will the man eventually choose? Wife Kitty and old sweetheart Margaret are the undeclared rivals for Chris, But this is the scaffold for a far more complex and demanding drama about class and gender pressed to extremes in wartime. For a start, the narrator Jenny is Chris's cousin, half in love with Chris herself and alternately jealous of other two women. Chris is also a man of substance, the owner of Baldry Court with its stables, kennels, and views of the wet emerald pasture land, a home made beautiful by Kitty and Jenny. The novel begins when Jenny and Kitty discover that Chris has been injured. They don't receive this news through the usual channel though, the decorated letter or telegram. A woman called Margaret Gray arrives with the message, a stranger to Jenny and Kitty. And this is the first sign that something is wrong. Chris's injury isn't immediately clear. He's been hurt, wounded, but not dangerously, written in the letter. Kitty is soon speculating that Chris may all be broken and queer, for Chris has amnesia, a shell burst, cell shock, there isn't a settled word for it, and he has lost or rejected 15 years of his life. He is unable to remember his wife, his marriage, his business, or the birth and death of his young son. He is locked in a time before the onset of the responsibilities he had when he was in love with Margaret, then unmarried. After a disastrous first evening on Baldry Road, Chris declares, "If I don't see Margaret Allington, I shall die." Kitty reluctantly accedes to his request. Well, what could Kitty do? In such a situation, she had no option. The competition between Kitty and Margaret is unequal in so many ways. To Kitty and Jenny, Margaret's class represents a crisis and a terrible disruption to the life of the world of Baldry Court. Jenny's first description of Margaret fixates on her chipped clothes, the re-dyed feather in her hat, her red seamed hands with a particularly feminine antagonism. She is described as something dirty, repulsively soiled with poverty and neglect, likened to a forgotten glove in hotel room. This is very important for your exam perspective because it could easily be said that write about the characters of Jenny, right? Margaret and the wife Kitty, right? There could be a comparison made between Kitty and Margaret. This could be a question which we will come and discuss in our later classes. For now, let's focus on the novel. Now, as you can see, I have written the first paragraph, which is exactly about it. I have mentioned how the former fiancée Margaret, right, versus the beautiful wife Kitty. Now at first, as you can see from the outset, Jenny and Kitty both view Margaret with disdain, noting her cheap clothes, the red-seamed hands of poverty and neglect. Jenny's description of Margaret blends revulsion with grudging admiration, likening her to a draught ox or the big trusted dog, a hint of Margaret's underlying strength despite social inferior status. Now let's come to the next part. The fact that the life of Baldry Court is much different than the life of the social class that Margaret was in can also be very important. Versus what Margaret says to Kitty by the way of an introduction. "My general sister to your second housemaid," quoted. Margaret has a maid, Kitty has numerous. Margaret is not working but lower middle class. Like the clerk Leonard Bast in Howard's End, the movie 1910, it is Margaret's social proximity that renders her repellent and dangerous, not her distance. Initially, Kitty refuses to believe that Margaret could even know Chris, accusing her of extortion. Jenny is kinder and unwillingly senses Margaret is telling the truth. Nevertheless, Jenny quickly rewrites honesty from this standpoint of pity, likening Margaret to a clumsy animal, a draught ox, or the big trusted dog. In quotations again. This is quoted directly from the book. The differences between Jenny and Kitty's understanding of Margaret are central, and as the novel progresses, the question of who Margaret really is comes to the fore. So, this is it for now. Let me know if you all want me to continue this novel. This was a test perspective novel, right?